Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm the creator and moderator of TheChocolateLife.com, and I'm the host of The Chocolate Life Live. Welcome to episode 70, where we're going to be taking a look at what I think is an interesting topic, which is the idea of downscaling production. Before we get into today's topic, what I would like to do is I would like to remind everybody that for every single one of these live streams, I do create a post on The Chocolate Life, and you can go to that post. Here, we're looking at the homepage live. We can go to the post, and if there are going to be any resources or images or things that are going to be shared during the course of the upcoming hour, they're going to be in this post added afterwards if they're not already a part of what it is that's going on. I'd like also to remind everybody that we do have a live chat and live comments feed. And so if you would like to, please go into the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and let me know where you're connecting from, where in the world you're connecting from. I know that this is seen all over the world and during the live part of it, as well as in replays. And so just let me know where you're connecting from today. And then, of course, you can also ask any questions that you might have over the course of the next hour about what it is that I'm going to be talking about today, which is downscaling production. So having gotten all of the intro out of the way here today, what I'd like to say is that it has been my experience over the almost 15 years now that the Chocolate Life has been in existence. It was founded in January. I first published it. The first went live in January of 2008. So we're coming up on the 15th anniversary, which I just mind-boggling to me. And thank everybody who's been a part of the journey from the beginning. Some of you, and those of you who have just joined. But in all the conversations that we had on the Chocolate Life, as people were asking questions about what was going on, it was always about, how do I start from production? So I'm not doing anything right now. How should I get into production? And then once I was in production, sort of irrespective of the means of production, once I have started producing, how do I go about scaling up production? So, for example, I've got a small hobby business. I'm one or two small melangers. And for the purposes of this discussion, what I'm going to do is suggest that a small melanger is anything under 35 kilograms. I mean, we can, and the reason why I'm doing that is that the most common melanger introduced was the Cocoa Down ECGC 65, which had a batch capacity of roughly 35 kilograms. There are obviously melangers that are much smaller than that. And so the questions became, how do we go about scaling up production? I am currently have a number of, for example, Spectra Santa or Cocoa Town tabletop grinders, and I'm going to move up from. So should I get more small ones or grow up to one or more big ones? That would be a great way to think about it. We could do what the Mast brothers did, is that they had at one point more than 20 of these 35 kilogram grinders. And what they did is they dedicated each grinder to a different origin. So there would be one or more which were dedicated to the Dominican Republic. There might be one which is dedicated, maybe they did a milk chocolate recipe, but you get the idea. They scaled up by getting more of the same machinery. Now, in my opinion, that's the least environmentally responsible way to scale up production. Every single one of these things has got a motor. They're all generating heat. And, if you've got 5 of them, is there a way to produce the same amount of chocolate in less time with more energy? And the answer to that question is yes. I mean, there's a case study that I can think of right off the top of my hand. Brian Graham at Fruition Chocolate replaced 3 or 4 35 kilo melangers with one 250 kilogram universal. And what he did is he, tripled or quadrupled his production capacity while reducing his energy costs. And part of the production capacity increase was not just the physical volume of the universal compared with the melangers, but it's also a reduced processing time. Now we are going from stone on stone to metal on metal, and we can have a much larger discussion about whether that's authentic or whether there are problems or issues associated with going from stone on stone to metal on metal. But that represents one way to think about how I'm going to scale up production. Another way, and this is sort of the way that I would approach it, would be to think about, okay, what is the part of my production that's taking the longest amount of time? So for example, if I am in a melanger and I'm currently running somewhere between 48 to 60 or 72 hours, what could I do to reduce the amount of time in the melanger? So if I am currently feeding nibs and sugar independently into the melanger, and I can't add them at all at once, otherwise the melanger will seize, then what I might think about doing is, can I get a pre-grinder? So if I can refine the nibs into a paste before I put it into the melanger, that will reduce some time. And then if I were to be able to pre-refine the sugar, preferably pre-refine the sugar into the paste, then what I can do is what I put into the melanger will require much less time in the melanger. And again, if it takes me an hour or two to process, the nibs which are required for a 35 kilogram batch, but I can reduce processing time by 5 to 6 to 7 hours, then that makes sense as a trade-off. The investment makes sense in the trade-off because of the time spent in reducing the processing time for a single batch. Other people may know also that I convinced FBM to introduce the first craft scale conch. So dedicated conch, called the Kligo, named after me. And this was in 2013 or 2014, I forget exactly when. But the idea was, if we can do just the conching step, which is flavor development and texture development in a separate device, then we can use the melanger for what it was designed for, which is basically a refiner, right? And if I can conch in 2 to 3 hours, what takes me 2 to 3 days in a melanger, then what I can do is I can get the product out of the melanger into the conch and start another batch right away. And so what we've done is we've said, rather than scale up production by saying, I'm going to do exactly what it is that I'm doing, but I'm going to get more machines and throw more machines of the same kind at the problem, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to get different machines. And another machine that you could throw in there would be a 3-roll refiner. So I could take liquor, I could mix the liquor with sugar, I could put it in a 3-roll refiner, I might run it through 1 or 2 times and then put it into the melanger. I mean, these are things that I can do which will reduce the amount of time spent in refining the sugar, because it's refining the sugar that takes the longest period of time in all of this. And by getting it out of the refiner into a conch, what we're doing is we're separating the refining component, right, the particle size reduction component, and the flavor and texture development into another device, right? And what that says is I now have multiple production pathways. So I could take the liquor, run the liquor through the conch, all right, and use conched liquor and then create recipes using conched liquor, as opposed to just there being a single linear step. And so I'm a big fan of thinking about upscaling production by thinking about incorporating different kinds of machines into production to give me multiple production pathways. And so, for example, if I were to be doing getting a 3-roll refiner, you can get a roll refiner which has got steel rollers, or a roll refiner which has got stone rollers. And in this particular case, I might get a granite roller refiner, because I could also do nut pastes. So by thinking about different kinds of equipment, what we do is give ourselves a number of different options and alternatives for being able to create different products, or to be able to play with different methodologies to give us a very different idea of what it is that can be done in terms of how does changing the order of production, right, change the quality of the finished chocolate. Right? And this becomes important, or it becomes an issue, because if I contend that going from 1 35 kilo melanger to 20 35 kilo melangers, right, is probably the least environmentally responsible way to scale up production from an energy perspective, then we need to start thinking about, should I scale up from, would it make more sense to scale up from one melanger at 35 kilos to a 100 kilo melanger or larger? Or would it make sense to go to a universal or a ball mill or some other production technology? And what happens when you move from one technology to another technology is you need to completely rethink the chocolate manufacturing process. And there are some examples. So we'll look at the companies in the craft chocolate industry here in the United States. I can think of three. One would be Manoa in Hawaii, French Broad in North Carolina, and Dandelion have gone into this small-scale ball mill production technology. And I think that if you were to talk with the production managers there, they've had to very, very much rethink how they manufacture the chocolate, because these different technologies produce very different products. In the end, the texture is different, and if you start scaling up production out of a melanger into so something like a more continuous production method, so for example, a ball mill, if you've got a large one, then you're thinking about materials handling. You're pumping product from one machine to another. You're not emptying into a bucket and then moving things from one machine to another, which is very, very common if we're working in the small melanger market. If I've got a 35 kilo melanger and I'm done, chances are I dump it out into a bucket or some sort of pan. I might let it cool and harden. I'm blocking it. I'm storing it for aging, right? And then I have to take it out of the pan and break it up into smaller bits in order to be able to melt it, in order to be able to go on and do the next step with. When you can certainly do this with ball mills, it's not the most efficient or effective way to use the technology. If I have a 50 kilo ball mill and a 250 kilo conch, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to do 5 50 kilo batches in the ball mill and then pump them into the conch, which is going to keep warm, and then run the conch. But I don't want to have to move the chocolate by hand. From the ball mill to the conch, I want to pump it from the ball mill to conch. And so materials handling becomes a really, really important aspect of the process when we think about scaling up production. Right. But in all the time that I've been doing this, I've never really run into the case where somebody has thought about, okay, we have an established business, and that business was a good business given what the texture of the market was, the way the market was organized, who we thought our customer base was. But times have changed. And so we're going to think about what we're producing and how we're producing it. And we're going to try to adapt to changes in the market. And I think that is a really interesting thought, even if it's something that you can't imagine ever, is as a part of what it is you're doing. You're a small chocolate maker. You're thinking about scaling up. The business is ramping up. How do I make more of what it is that I'm doing? How do I make more of it more cost effectively? Which I think is an important aspect of the scaling up. How do I make what it is that I'm doing more cost effective? How do I make what I'm doing more cost effectively? Is something that's on our minds, and we have to balance what our mission is, what it is we want to accomplish, what the ethos of the company is, with the cost of production, with the cost of sales, with how much it is we're selling. And so this is a very, very delicate question about balancing the business interests and the production interests, and what does that mean for the capital expenditure costs. And every single company wrestles with these issues in their own way, depending on the way they see their business and their own circumstances, and who they think their customer base are. And so that's why I want to spend a little time thinking about this from the other way around. So there's an established business. In this case, the established business is seen. Let me scroll very quickly and change the view. In this case, what we're doing, let me go and take a look at the image this way. So this is the entrance to an existing production plant in Duran, which is a suburb of Guayaquil in Ecuador. And this plant is from a company called Cafiesa. So Cacaos Finos Ecuatorianos, I believe, is the name of the company. And it was established in the 1970s. It was established by a gentleman by the name of Jose Carvajal and Jose's family, their business in cocoa stretches back to the early days of Grand Cacao, through cacao farming in around a town called Catarama, which is, I believe, it's on the border of Guayas. It might be in Los Rios, but the family has been involved in cocoa growing for over 100 years, and has been manufacturing chocolate for something like 50 years. And they created over time, I don't think they necessarily started out at the size, but over time, they ended up growing into a production facility that could manufacture 300 metric tons of product per month. And this 300 metric tons was primarily derivatives. So they're primarily doing liquor, butter, powder, right, and nibs. That's what they're doing. They're doing organic. They have the capability of doing organic production. They're doing conventional production. There was also a chocolate manufacturing plant in there as well. So they could actually take all of the derivative products that they were using and manufacture finished chocolate. And their primary customers were, as you might imagine, at producing 300 metric tons per month, their primary customers were bigger industrial companies who could commit to purchasing large quantities of product from them on a regular basis. However, the commodity market, so we think of cocoa beans as a commodity market, but it turns out that butter and powder are also commodified in many respects. So when the demand for butter is high, the price for butter is high. When the demand for butter is high and cocoa powder is lower, the price for cocoa powder goes down, and all sorts of complex interactions that many people might not think about. And then if a particular customer is saying, listen, we've overcommitted, we're having a problem in our business, we can't commit to purchasing from you, so we're going to stop purchasing from you for right now. There's nothing that a plant like this can do. There's not a whole lot of, I think, resilience might be a good way to think about what you might do with production capacity that you find yourself underutilized. And so what we're looking at here is the introduction to the old Cafeesa plant. There is gates into which trucks with cocoa beans would come in. And to the right, off camera, so a little to the right of where this vehicle is, there is an entrance to a bean cleaner and destoner. So the beans are unbagged, they're tossed into the bean cleaner and destoner, then they are moved. And if you look very, very carefully, if I can, that there is a chute right here. My cursor is running across at the arrow. So the beans, which have been cleaned and destoned, are moving into this long cylindrical tube. And this tube is heated, and they are destroying all the bacteria and some and things that might be on the outside of the beans. And for some reason, my mind just blanked on the term. You'll excuse me. And from here, the beans go into a large room where there are roasters and crackers and winnowers and sanitized is the word I was thinking of. The processes happen inside. What you're looking at here is a tower that's associated with the deodorizing plant. And so just to, this is a very, very large plant, right? But one of the challenges with this plant that wasn't an issue in the 1970s, or wasn't as much as an issue in the 1970s and the 1980s, is that in order to be able to produce anything, the entire plant needs to be turned on, which means, the minimum order quantity in this factory is 10 metric tons. You need to process 10 metric tons of beans in terms of a confirmed contract in order to make it cost efficient to be able to turn the entire plant on. And part of that is that, number one, it runs mostly on petrochemicals. Diesel fuel is used to fire the boilers, which generate the heat, which is used to keep things warm. So it's, as you might imagine, in this day and age, it's very, very expensive to just turn the plant on. And there are not necessarily a whole lot of customers which require 10 metric tons in terms of a minimum order quantity. Those customers, many of them are building their own plant. For example, Barry Callebaut has now as a manufacturing plant in Ecuador. And so some of their customers may have gone away. Now, again, to give you an idea of scale, this is in the old factory. This is a room in which there were five cocoa butter pot presses, right? And just to give you an idea, so the only thing that was done in this room was processing cocoa butter. So it went to, it may have gone into another room for filtration. It may have gone to another room where the deodorizing plant for the cocoa butter that was deodorized. I mean, this is a very, very large bit of infrastructure. And you have to move from room to room to room, right, in order to be able to move through it, which means that all of the materials are pumped in one form or another from one room to another room to another room. And it is this interconnectedness. If I need to be able to, run some cocoa butter, I need to start all the way back at the front end. I need to turn on the bean sanitizer. I need to turn on the roasters. I need to turn on the cracker winnowers. I need to turn on all the liquor grinding stations. I need to turn everything on in order to be able to do this. And because of the scale, it is a relatively expensive proposition. And so it's in that context, right, that number one, it's become increasingly expensive to turn the plant on. The minimum order quantity has gone up to 10 metric tons, or has not gone up to, but the minimum order quantity is metric tons. And since this factory was built, the entire craft chocolate and the entire sort of middle market, small market chocolate industry has just expanded rapidly. And so part of the challenge is, in terms of downscaling production or thinking about downscaling production, is what can we do, right, in order to meet the change in the market. Let me do something. I'm gonna just okay. I just wanted to check something in terms of bandwidth locally. I noticed that my Wi-Fi connection was not as stable as I wanted it to be, and I hope that hasn't interfered with anything you've all seen. But when we think about the way the market has changed, so not as many big customers, there's this fact that the customers will put a halt on orders when business is not favorable in their terms. It's cyclical, butter up, powder down. All of these things, all right, in addition to the fact that there's been this explosion in craft chocolate makers, explosion in smaller chocolate companies. There's a desire for many of these chocolate companies to have customized products, and they'd like to get closer to their farmers and things like that. This is the background, right, by which the change in terms of thinking about downscaling is happening. Another thing which is happening here, which is important to recognize, is that there's a generational change. So what has happened is the founder of this business, Jose Carvajal, is getting to an age where he doesn't want to be involved necessarily in the day-to-day business aspects of this. And so he's passing it on, the business on to the next generation. And daughter Lila Carvajal has taken it over. And as part of taking it over, what she's wanted to do is she's want to reimagine the business. Right? And that is what it is that she's done. And so going from Cafeeza to a new company called CocoSupply.com, also known as Chocolatier SA. And I'm saying that because Ecuadorian business rules about what you call businesses are rather specific. And so we've gone from the old factory to the new facility. And this is the yard where trucks full of cocoa beans will come in and be accepted. So there is a gate here that you can see where wiggling my cursor, this brown area. And there is a storage area to the right where the bags of beans are stored, waiting to be processed. There's also some small facilities, I believe, for fermentation and drying, should anything need either of those processes. But in general, I think what Cocoa Supply is doing is they're purchasing in already dried beans. And they have a particular ethos within the company to be able to go and know the sources from whom they're buying. And so there are some very, very particular examples of working with smallholder farmers, and they will act as the intermediary if what you as a chocolate maker are looking for is the ability to be able to speak confidently about where your beans come from and are they produced, without deforestation, without child labor? Are they actually produced organically? I mean, all of these kinds of things. Then a cocoa supply can act as an intermediary because in part of the scale that they are working on. They have that ability. So from the, once the beans are accepted, this is again outdoors. It's to the right over my shoulder as I'm taking this picture, is a bean cleaning and destoning plant. So the bags of beans are taken into this facility. You can see there's a conveyor that goes up and drops them into this buffer tank. And from the buffer tank, they are conveyed into a cleaner and destoner in multiple stages, right? And so this is not, so it's important to say they've gone from 300 metric tons a month. And when I say downscaling means 100 metric tons a month, right? So it is huge compared with craft chocolate standards, right? But it is small compared with what the previous facility was capable of producing every month. So once they get done, right, they come out of the bean cleaner and destoner, they get conveyed up to the top of this tower. And from there, they go into, this is all done outside, they go inside. And inside, you can see this tank here, and that tank is holding the cleaned beans. So from the cleaned beans, the beans, you can see a little conveyor right here, screw, and the beans come from the bottom of the tank and they're put into this device, which is a bean roaster. And so this would be considered to be a pre-roaster. Here's the output of the roaster. And the important aspect of this roaster is what they're doing. All that they're doing is that they're heating the beans relatively quickly to a fairly high temperature and getting the beans to puff up. So the moisture in the bean on the surface of the bean is going to expand. And what that's going to do is it's going to slightly release the shell, right, from the bean inside. And there is some glue, I suppose, adhesive action with the fat. So the cocoa butter is keeping the shell and the bean together by puffing this up using the moisture that's in the bean, roughly 6 to 7% moisture in the bean, expanding it. What they're able to do is they're able to take a look, and they're able to take a look is the wrong word. What they're able to do is separate the shell from the bean inside with the idea of making it easier to crack and winnow the bean. So there's a lot going on in this picture. This is an old Bauermeister cracker and winnower. As you can see, originally it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 viewports in here. This cracker and winnower was originally designed to produce 5 different fractions of beans. There was probably an impact cracker in front of this as a separate device. So this big impact cracker would have cracked the beans and it would have gone into here and it would have been separated into 5 fractions and then a separate fraction of fines. And so what's interesting about this, again, I didn't take this photograph specifically to show this, is that there is a little cracker. You can see my cursor running over it. So this is a cracker that's going on here. The beans are transferred from the roaster to this cracker. They are cracked. And then they are hoisted up. So you can see they're hoisted up here. And the first thing that happens is that this entire aspect of the machine is not original to the machine. It's not, you'll never see this on a Bauermeister cracker and winnower. What actually Jose Carvajal, who studied mechanical engineering in Germany, brought to this entire project was to take machinery and to customize the machinery. And so what's happening here is that the winnowing is happening up here. I mean, there's no real winnowing per se that's happening in the rest of the Bauermeister. It's used to transport things, but the winnowing is happening up here. And again, not something you normally see, but here is a little what we would call scalping deck. So if there are beans which have not been fully cracked or cracked at all, they're scalped off the top and they return to the cracker. And from the return to the cracker, they come back in here. But all of the winnowing is done before the separation is done here. And what was fascinating to me about this is that this cracker is designed to produce a single size fraction of nibs, right? And then fines, right? So only two, which is, even though the base machine is designed to take cracked beans and then winnow them into up to 5 fractions, this machine only does 2 fractions. And what's fascinating about that is, if we go back to the cracker here, what we'll see is that the cracker itself can be tuned to produce a specific size of nib. Right? So if I have a customer and the customer is looking for an average of X number of millimeters, or smaller or bigger, then the cracker can be tuned for that. And that's what it is that this entire machinery here is going to produce. So they've rethought the way the cracking and winnowing process can be done. I think it's a fascinating bit of discovery. And take a look. I mean, here are examples of shells which come out of this approach to cracking and winnowing. And for people who have used any other device for cracking and winnowing, looking at the average size of shell that's produced, this is pretty remarkable in terms of the size of shell. Very, very big, as you can see. And that's because of the technology of the cracker itself, and the fact that they're winnowing it before they actually separate out the full-size fractions from the fines. A very, very different approach. Now, what's also fun to notice is that here, so this tube right here at the bottom, so at the bottom, there is a chute, and that chute goes off to a bin where they capture the fines. But the nibs, right, are transported up this tube to the next stage, which would be a nib roaster. Right. So it's a batch nib roaster. It's about 600 kilos. And that sort of determines, that 600 kilo capacity of the nib roaster pretty much determines what the minimum order quantity is. We're going to process enough beans to get a 600 kilos of nibs. We got a minimum order quantity of 600 kilos. I think really, really interesting decision here. I don't have a picture of the nib roaster, but what I will say is, because of the way this is done, because it's a batch nib roaster, not a continuous nib roaster, that there is some ability to be able to change the roast. So if you want a more heavily roasted nib as opposed to a more lightly roasted nib, you could do that. You could also say, I don't want any additional roasting to happen whatsoever. And you could intercept the nibs before they went into the roaster and bag them, right? And ship them out separately. So this talks to not only, I think, an important realization, which is, okay, what I want to do is I want to take the minimum order quantity down from, say, 10 metric tons down to 600 kilograms, right? And that there's a modular component. If what it is they want to do is only produce nibs, then what they can do is they can stop here with unroasted or roasted nibs, and that's the end of the process. So they don't have to turn on any of the machinery that's downstream of the nib production, right, in order to do any production whatsoever. And so I think that's just a really, really interesting aspect of what's going on, is that they've completely modularized the process and only need to turn on the parts of the factory that are appropriate for what it is they're doing for any particular product or project. We have a question from Candy's Chocolate. Is it by vacuum or conveyor upwards of the nibs? I believe in this particular case, they are in fact using a screw conveyor. But throughout the factory, you will find a mix of screw conveyors and vacuum conveyors and pumps, depending on what it is that they're moving around the factory. In this particular case, a screw conveyor, I believe that there are other places where there may be vacuum conveyors. I do want to say that there are some aspects of this process that I'll show you a picture of later, that there is some desire to keep sort of not, proprietary, at least somewhat confidential. And so, there's a picture I will show later, which the details of which have been obscured for that reason. But from here, what we can do is we can go to the nib roaster, and from the nib roaster, what happens here is we are transporting the nibs via this pipe. So this pipe here, we're transporting the nibs via the pipe into the next room, right? And the next room is where we'll find the liquor grinders as well as the cocoa butter press. But I believe if we're looking at this, I don't think it looks like a vacuum conveyor. It looks like it might be, or a vacuum transport. It looks like it might be a conveyor. And, it would make sense for nibs that would be the case. I think mostly screw conveyors. So in the next room, what we do is we find here are the liquor grinders. And you'll notice that we have I want you to notice that there are two different kinds of liquor grinders. Here, to the right, is a pinmill grinder. And to the left here, what we have is a disc grinder. It may be carborundum. So this would be a more traditional, you can think of, many people have burr mill grinders in which the burrs are vertical. In this particular case, it's a grinder where the grinding discs are horizontal. Now, my understanding here is I can choose one of these or the other. So we see this holding bin, this holding tank for the nibs up here, right? And what they're doing is they're transporting it. And it looks like I have the option of going into the pinmill or going into the disc grinder. And it may be, I seem to recall that I can go from one to the other. So I might start off with a coarser pinmill grind and then go into the disc grind, or vice versa for one reason or another. But we have a holding tank here. And this is one thing that's interesting, I think, for people to consider, is that part of the materials handling process in factories like this is that different processes don't necessarily happen in real time or happen at the same time. And so you need buffer tanks to be able to take the output of one process and hold it going into the next process. And so you'll see in some of these pictures holding tanks of one form or another between the processes. Whoops, excuse me. I have to be more careful about what I click on. So from the two nib grinders, there's a series of holding tanks. And from the nib grinders, we're going through a series of vibratory screeners. So these vibratory screeners will get out any large particles which are unwanted, which is an important aspect of what's going on. And one thing I probably did not mention was that out in the back where there's a destoner and bean cleaner, there's almost certainly a magnetic trap. So if, for example, for one reason or another, a nail or some other bit of metal got into a bag of beans, the magnetic trap would be there to prevent that from getting any further into the process and wrecking any of the machinery. So really, really important to know. And if you're making chocolate in the United States, there is in fact an FDA regulation that says you need to have a magnetic trap as part of your bean acceptance cleaning process. So, when you open up a bag of beans for cleaning the bag of beans, there should be a magnetic trap somewhere that you're pouring the beans through in order to make sure that if there is any magnetic metal, because there are non-magnetic metals, but if there is anything which can be magnetized, you're going to pull it out of the beans before you get into the next step. So important to consider. There is a holding tank back here. You can see that. And then, in fact, there is an entire room of holding tanks. Right? So the liquor, after it is ground and filtered, is pumped into this room. And in this room, which is warm, by the way, there are a number of tanks here. And these tanks hold the liquor. And they act as a buffer. And they also act to condition. You can hold it here if for some reason there is a need to age. Right, any liquor for any purpose. And the pumps are here so that you can move, you can choose to move the liquor from any of these different holding tanks into the next step. Right. The next step here, of course, is the cocoa butter press. Right. So the cocoa butter press, actually, these two presses that are here, you can only see the front one, came from the old factory. Right? So they were repurposed, just moved a couple hundred meters, and they become part of the new factory. And what we see here is, again, something because of the scale of this and the automation of this. We'll get to the downstream parts of this. But one of the reasons why there are two cocoa butter presses, and one of the reasons why there are these large holding tanks, is that I need to fill one of these presses, and then I need to run it through a pressing cycle. And if I have two of them, what I can be doing is I can be filling the press during the pressing cycle of the other press. And after I get done releasing the pressure on one of the presses, I can start a pressing cycle on the other press, right, while I'm kicking out the press cake, and then I'm getting ready to fill it again with liquor. And so this is another aspect of thinking about production. Again, we've gone from 300 metric tons a month to 100 metric tons a month. May not feel like downscaling. Right, we've gone from a 10 metric ton minimum order quantity to a 600 kilogram 600 kilogram minimum order quantity. That sounds like it's scaling down production significantly, right? So really, really important to think about this in all these different kinds of ways. What's happening here is that 600 kilo minimum order quantity gives them flexibility, gives cocoa supply flexibility in terms of the kinds of customer requests that they can fulfill. Now, they need to clean the line. If they're going from conventional production to organic production, and they do organic production in this facility, they decided not to continue to manufacture chocolate in this facility. So they're not introducing any milk allergens. There's no sugar in the facility. All they're doing is they're processing cocoa beans in here to derivatives, right? So they're not making finished chocolate. What they have done is they've established a relationship with one of the other major chocolate manufacturers that are in the country. And what they can do is they can send their liquor to another location. There, the liquor can be transformed into finished chocolate, right, on behalf of a customer. So a customer could come to them and say, I need a metric ton of chocolate, but I also need a couple hundred kilos of cocoa butter and cocoa powder. And it can all come from the same beans, right? Even if it's not all produced in the same factory. And there's the same level of, because the beans are all processed into derivatives in one place, what we do is we have good confidence in the representations that are being made about where the beans come from. Right. And so, the facility does organic and conventional production. They do it by scheduling production. And so you might come in and say, listen, I need, a metric ton of organic production. And they'll say, okay, well, the next time the factory is going to be running any organic products is going to be, next month. And you're just going to need to wait until next month, right, when we do that conversion. Right. So it's not something like, okay, right, well, I'm going to interrupt everything and just clean everything down and then converted from conventional to organic just for one small run. These things need to be scheduled. And this is fairly common when it comes to scaling production up. Just production scheduling becomes a really, really important aspect of what you're doing. Once you get out of the very small scale and you start thinking about this as a real business, that I need to be able to ensure that I have a steady supply of product as opposed to a hobby level business. Really, really important to consider. So I want to recognize that the time has gone by incredibly quickly. We're at 45 minutes past the hour. I want to thank everybody for joining me here today. I've got two comments in here. Number one, Candy. We have Don Quinn. Don is talking about a food festival that's happening next August. And any help, want someone to demonstrate making chocolate and also chocolate sellers. So Don, I think that the best way to do that is you can send me an email at TCL, so TheChocolateLife, TCL _info at TheChocolateLife.com. And if you do that, what I can do is perhaps put you into some people. I'm guessing Cresting Temple Essex is in the UK. I don't know how many people in the UK are seeing this right now, but I think that trying to reach out to somebody in the UK would be the way to do this. And I may be able to help you talk to some people who may be able to do that. So thanks for letting me know. I hope that you have great success next August in what it is that you're doing. But there's nothing that I can do to help you today in terms of getting somebody to demonstrate chocolate making in a festival for next August. So again, thank you very much for everybody who's connecting. If there are more of you who are watching, what you'd like to do is you'd like to let me know where you're connecting from. If you have a question, please put your comments and questions into the chat or comments section of wherever you happen to be watching this, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and I will put them up on screen and answer them. And again, we're here talking about scaling down production, right? And scaling down production. So if we think about, I've started off in like 5 35 kilo melangers, and for some reason the business is not taking off the way I wanted to, then scaling down production means I'm only running 1 or 2 of the melangers rather than all 5. I've scaled up production. I've gone from a very, very small batch roaster to something which is a larger roaster. I've upgraded my cracking and winnowing capacity to match my refining capacity, right? So, if it takes me 48 hours to run something in a melanger, then I need to be able to I need to roast and crack and winnow however many beans will give me the nibs that I need for whatever recipe that I'm doing in that 48-hour window. If I have 5 of those things, obviously I have 48 by 5. I now need to get everything done within 9 hours in order to be able to keep up with the production of the melangers. So I've scaled up that way. When I'm scaling down production, right, it's a matter of now I just have a lot of excess capacity. If I was thinking about 5 35 kilo melangers, that's 175 kilos, probably running that twice a week, 350 kilos a week. So if I have to cut that in half, if I've scaled up my roasting capacity and my cracking and winnowing capacity, what I'm doing is I'm spending a lot less time roasting and cracking and winnowing in order to be able to have the nibs necessary to do 4 batches a week as opposed to 10 batches a week, right? So scaling down, if I've gone this, it's very easy, right, at the scale of a number of melangers. But scaling down from 300 metric tons to 100 metric tons is an entirely different process. And I wanted to go through some of the thinking process. Number one, why would we do that, right? So we're thinking about scaling down production because A, the market has changed, right? And that's the primary reason, right? We don't want to be reliant on a relatively small number of very big customers. What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to serve a much larger universe of smaller customers, right? And we want to be able to provide customization via smaller minimum order quantities. And we want to be able to get our customers closer to the source of their beans if that's what it is that they desire, right? So that's one aspect of it, which is really important. And the other one is this generational change. And I think that's the generational change is one of the things that inspired the conversations around this topic, very, very importantly. But this new factory is very definitely a beneficiary of the mechanical engineering expertise of Jose and the 40 years or 50 years that he's had running a chocolate manufacturing facility. So in terms of the customization of equipment, in terms of getting things to run, and I can tell you that this is an old used cocoa butter press. It comes from the original factory. We saw that Bauermeister cracker and winnower. It's an old used bit of machine, and we'll find some brand new stuff that was manufactured in China, as well as this old stuff. So it's a mixture of whatever components seem to be appropriate at the right price point for doing what it is that needs to get done. Something that many people don't think about because they're not producing their own cocoa butter is, what do I do with what's left over after I remove the butter? And so in a particular case, what we see here is right here, right under the press, there's what's called the cake kibbler. And so the press cakes can be a couple of inches thick, somewhere between 7.5 to 10 centimeters thick, perhaps. And they can be 30 centimeters in diameter, depending on the size of the press and the number of pots and lots of other variables. And what has to happen is that those big press cakes are broken up into bits. And those bits are called kibble, look like dog kibble. The process is called kibbling or cake breaking. So there's a cake breaker, which is located here under the press. And from that cake breaker, the kibble, the bits are then transferred along this tube into, again, probably it's either a belt conveyor or a screw conveyor, I'm not certain what it is, into a pin mill. And I believe I have a photograph of the pin mill next to it. So yeah, here's the pin mill. We can see the cake breaker in the background. So things come out of the cocoa butter press and they go into the breaker and they're transferred from the breaker into the pin mill. And from that pin mill, they are then transferred via this tube. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not certain if it's a vacuum tube or if it's some other form of conveyor. It did not occur to me to ask the kind of conveyor inside of many of these things. I was just thinking of them pumps and conveyors, not the specific kind of conveyor. But you can see that from the cocoa butter press, we automatically break the cake. The cake is then run through a pin mill. The pin mill is then spent, the powder is then sent into another room. And in that other room, there is machinery which is going to grade it by size, and then pack it into boxes. I think either 1 kilo boxes or 25 kilo boxes, depending what you're looking for. But you can see this is an entirely hands-off operation, right? Which is, important for what's going on. But if all I needed to do was produce butter and powder, I could stop at this. I could take it into the next step, right? If I had a big buffer of liquor, I wouldn't necessarily need to turn on the roasting and the crackling and winnowing part of the plant because I've already got liquor on hand that I can process into butter and cocoa, right? Makes sense. And it should be obvious, although I didn't say it, that from the holding room where the tanks are, which are holding the liquor, I could go straight into a room where this product is deposited and then cooled, right? So I don't actually need to go through the butter processing, the butter manufacturing process and the cocoa powder processing at all. I can just go straight into depositing the liquor, right? And it's thinking about the individual components of the process and breaking them down and separating them. Each one of them, for the most part, is in its own room, and things are transported from one room to another. But what does the ability to only turn on part of the factory mean? So number one is the most important, is that my startup costs are much lower. They've gone from primarily a petroleum and diesel based system. So right now they are almost completely solar powered or electrically powered. They're installing solar panels on the roofs of the facility right now, and they intend to be primarily solar powered by the end of 2023. So they've reduced their reliance on the grid. They become much less expensive, energy independent for the most part. I don't know that they will be 100% free of petrochemicals, but they are doing the best that they can to reduce their reliance on energy which comes from any petroleum source. And that's a lot easier to do when all you need to do is turn on a small part of the factory at a time. You don't need to turn on everything. You don't need to generate enormous amounts of heat in order to do it. And I would imagine, even though in the older plant, some of the pumps might be diesel powered, that a lot of the energy consumption in the older plant has to do with generating the heat necessary to keep everything fluid, is generating the heat necessary to sanitize the beans, right? I would guess that's where a lot of that is done. So the butter, when it comes out of the presses, is not, because it's fluid, it's pumped. I can tell you that it's pumped. And I can't tell you the kind of pump. It may be a lobe pump. That would make sense for the kind of fluids that are being pushed around. But as opposed to a screw pump or any other kind of pump, probably a lobe pump. And you can see here in the butter processing room is that we have a number of different tanks. These tanks are there so that we can hold conventional versus organic butter. We can also hold deodorized butter and undeodorized butter. And the butter can be filtered or non-filtered. So in the front, we see a pair of filter presses. The press is filled, and then the press is closed, and the butter is expelled from that. And what is left over, the residue of very, very small fine particles, is then taken out of the press plates and the filter plates, and One of the things that impressed me is that that Cocoa Supply, Lila, Cocoa Supply is looking for uses for all of the what might be considered waste products. So what are they doing with the shells? We had a fantastic discussion about doing something very, very interesting with the fines that I don't think anybody else is doing right now that I would love to see being done. And so there's some exploration being done on using the fines in a way that I don't think anybody else is using them at the moment. And then what can be done with a fairly heavy fat-laden residue from this? I don't know the answer to that question, but it is something that's worth being done. And so you see here, again, in its own room, the filtering and the processing of the cocoa butter is being done. And this is the last photo, I believe, and it is the photo that I probably the most confidential in terms of what's being done in there. This is a small deodorizing plant. And I'm not going to say anything other than this, but this is a small deodorizing plant. It's about maybe 1.5 meters from front to back. It may be 4 meters long, so somewhere between 12 and 15 feet long. And it's up to the top here. It's about 2.5 meters tall. And so when there is the need to do some deodorized cocoa butter, this is the plant. Now, this is a machinery. This is a bit of machinery, a bit of kit that was purchased to do this from a manufacturer in China, and it was extensively reworked in order to be able to make it functional in this environment. This is not necessarily a bit of kit you'd be able to buy and expect to get to work off the shelf, right? But this is a small deodorizing plant. So they do exist if you do want to do deodorized cocoa butter. Now, if you're in the craft chocolate industry and you're doing cocoa butter, you're not doing it to this scale, and you probably want to use undeodorized cocoa butter so that if you add cocoa butter into your recipes, it will have the same flavor as the liquor or the nibs and beans that you're using. But finding a small deodorizing plant like this, you may remember, let's go back to this. You may remember that when I showed you this picture, that this is the tower for the deodorizing plant in the old factory. And what they've got in the new factory is a much smaller deodorizing plant. A couple of comments. Candies says, certainly landscape mulch is something that you can do with shells. And yeah, it's a good idea in many respects. You do need to be careful. Number one, landscape mulch, you have to be careful about dogs because the shells concentrate the theobromine. And if the dogs if a dog has ever been exposed to chocolate and likes the smell of chocolate and smells the cocoa beans, they might consume the shells. And so you need to be very, very careful because, again, the theobromine is concentrated in the shells. Another thing to think about is that the shells are also a bioaccumulator of any heavy metals. So if there is any cadmium in the soil or lead or anything which might have precipitated from the sky, so that it will accumulate on the shells. And so you need to be very careful to test the shells to make sure that if you are going to be using them as a mulch around edible plants, so you're using in the garden, right, that you wouldn't want to do that necessarily because it could introduce chemicals into the soil, right? Heavy metals, for example, that you don't want to be there, and you don't want to be uptaken by your carrots or other root vegetables that you might be growing. So there are examples of using it in landscape mulch, but I would think that you want to use it as a decorative mulch, and you want to be careful about dogs who might be exposed to it. So somebody from North Queensland Chocolate. Hey, thank you very much for connecting in Queensland, Australia, I'm guessing. That may be the most remote that anybody has checked in. So thank you very much. I'm a big fan. Members of my family don't live in North Queensland, but I've got family in Adelaide and Sydney and Melbourne and down in Anglesey. And so I've been to Australia on a couple of occasions. I love being there. It's got a very, very vibrant chocolate industry. Australia and New Zealand are doing some really, really fabulous things. And I do know that they grow cacao, I believe, in the Northern Territories, up not in Cairns, but towards Darwin. which makes sense because it's fairly close to Papua New Guinea. So I'm really excited about the opportunity, perhaps, of being able to return to Australia and see what's going on there sometime in the very near future. Yep, North Queensland. So you asked the question, why do you deodorize the butter, right? The reason why you might want butter deodorized is you might want to use it in a cosmetic where you're going to add other aromas to it, and you do not want the aroma of cocoa butter you do not want the aroma of cocoa or chocolate in the butter. And so what you're going to do is you're going to process it. So often this is a process that uses toxic chemicals, solvents such as butane, to strip out these chemicals which give aroma and flavor to the butter. And the reason you'd want to get rid of them is, number one, is there is a cosmetic or pharmaceutical reason for wanting a fat which is neutral. And keep in mind that one of the reasons why cocoa butter is liked as a fat is because of its melting point. It melts just at body temperature. And so it fits into cosmetics in a very, very particular kind of way. And entire large amounts of industry is built around producing the cocoa butter as a derivative product. And so deodorized cocoa butter is used in pharmaceuticals. The other reason why you might want to deodorize a cocoa butter is if you're making an industrial chocolate. And again, the definition of industrial chocolate is I have an end point in mind, right? So I have this profile flavor that the chocolate needs to be when I get done. And then I'm going to do everything I can during the manufacturing process. Let me jump in here. I'm going to do everything I can in the manufacturing process in order to be able to bring all the ingredients that I put in together. And the ingredients may change in flavor from time to time, right? So cocoa is a varietal product. It changes from harvest to harvest as an agricultural product. It will change from one part of the year to another part of the year, depending upon what the weather is in one part of the country. And so you have a variable product as an input into the finished product. And part of industrial manufacturing is being able to say, we don't care what the flavor of the input is, we have a particular output that we're looking for. And one of the reasons why you might use a deodorized cocoa butter is if I'm adding a lot of cocoa butter relatively into the recipe, I don't want to have to factor in the flavor of the cocoa butter, right, as an ingredient in the recipe. It becomes another variable that I need to consider, right, in terms of flavor. And that's not something I might want to do. And so that would be a reason why you might use a deodorized cocoa butter in a chocolate recipe. And as a matter of fact, almost all industrial chocolate is made when cocoa butter is added. Almost all of the cocoa butter is in fact deodorized, right? For that reason, they just don't want to have to calculate in the flavor of the cocoa butter into their recipe. Now, a craft chocolate maker would say, if I'm adding cocoa butter that doesn't have a flavor, then all I'm doing is diluting the flavor of the liquor. And so that's one of the reasons why people who are in the 2-ingredient craft chocolate camp will say, I don't want to add any cocoa butter at all, even if it is undeodorized, because I believe it will affect the flavor negatively in terms of what it is that I'm trying to make as a chocolate. I disagree. If you can use undeodorized cocoa butter that's made from the same beans, so if a small butter press and you can create butter from the same beans that you're using to make the chocolate, I would say use it, especially when you're using a low-fat bean, something which is towards the 47% end. If you're doing a 70% chocolate, it means you're down at around 30% fat, which is fairly low. Getting it up about above 35% fat is going to help you in the tempering process, among other things, and fluidity just generally. And so adding enough cocoa butter to make your life easy is something certainly I recommend to craft chocolate makers. And one way to do that would be to have a small butter press to produce undeodorized cocoa butter from the same beans that you're working with your chocolate. But I don't have your name at North Queensland Chocolate. I hope that answered your questions for today about that whole process. And so what I want to do is say, man, this hour just went incredibly fast. We're a little bit over, and I want to thank everybody for joining me today. So thanks for the comment, brilliant, comprehensive. Thanks for the detail and answering. It was my pleasure. And that's one of the reasons why I do this. I mean, it's not fun for me, or it's not as fun for me. I mean, I do love to hear myself talk, as people will say. And I think I know a little bit about stuff and have something to share. But certainly the opportunity to be able to put out a provocative topic and then get questions from people and answering those questions in this context is one of the reasons why I do this. I've been working in the field of chocolate professionally since 1998. I've been researching chocolate since 1994. I've been on farms, I've been to factories, done consumer education. And so, I'm looking to provide people with some of the experience that I have as they move forward into whatever level of appreciation of chocolate that they might have. And with that, I want to talk about a couple of things. Now, first thing, really, really quickly, is that if you are interested in the United States or in Europe, Cocoa Supply does have a US website and do have a European website, and they sell lots of stuff. All right. So if you're interested in butter, powder, any kind of derivatives, they also sell beans, but they also have freeze-dried powders. So if you want cocoa pulp powder or as you can see here, passion fruit powder, which I've tasted, is quite lovely. Cocoa Supply is a great source if you're here in the United States or in Europe. They're also in the Chocolate Life Holiday Gifting Guide. If you want to purchase anything from Cocoa Supply in the US, I believe, I'm not sure if will work in the European site, but there's a discount code on the Chocolate Life Holiday Gifting Guide, and you can get 5% off, except for shipping on everything in the store. And before I go, what I want to, I'm going to quick this up. Mark and Yuri, Bruce in Colorado, Denver. Great to get a better understanding of the background of Cacao Supply. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. I mean, I'm lucky because the Cocoa Supply warehouse is in Brooklyn, not far from where it is that I am. I can go over there and meet with Lila in person. We've had several conversations about what it is she's doing and why she's doing it. It's why I was introduced to the factory in Duran to be able to write the story, which I did for International Confectionery Magazine for their December issue. And I got a chance to see the relationship that the company maintains with one smallholder farmer. And so it is that, personal introduction and getting the nuance and sort of understanding some of the detail, which I think is really, really important. Because I think that, what small chocolate makers are looking to do, not just small chocolate makers, but chocolate makers of all sizes are looking to do increasingly, is to have confidence, right, in the representations they make to their customers about the sources of supply. So if I am buying cocoa butter, whether it's deodorized or undeodorized, I'd like to know the people who are making the cocoa butter and the background of the company. And it may not be on their website. And so being able to provide this background, I think, is really, really important, because if what we want to do is we want to be good storytellers, having confidence in our sources at all levels is really, really important. And so that's one of the reasons. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, and Candy, thanks very much from Ocala, Florida. So great to have you back. Candy and Ted, have been longtime supporters of mine. I met them in classes that I co-produced for FBM at the Jean-Marie Aubin School in Las Vegas, Nevada. They were big supporters of mine in my 20th anniversary tasting. And so, you know what? I realized that I did it again. So I'm going to go do this really, really quickly for everybody. If you go to The Chocolate Life right now, I have a holiday gifting guide, and you can see that there is an entrance for the Cocoa Supply website, and then there's a code that you can enter on the bottom for getting this 5% discount. I'm doing all of the back and forth and everything here myself, and so sometimes I get stuck in the narrative of what it is that I want to say and lose sight of what's going on in the background. So please accept my apologies is the wrong word. I'm doing everything that I can here. What I also want to point out is that this coming Friday is a real special Friday for me. I haven't posted it on The Chocolate Life yet. I'm going to do it in the calendar. So Again, everybody, so here's the Chocolate Life Live. I maintain a calendar, and this calendar includes not only upcoming streams, I have done it. So today, downscaling chocolate production. On Friday, we're going to be talking to Raven Hanna. And Raven Hanna may be known to many people as the molecular muse. When I met her for the first time, this would have been in early 2010, she was producing jewelry. And one of the bits of jewelry that she was producing then was a molecular model of theobromine. So you could get a theobromine molecule in silver on a chain you could wear around your neck. So that's one of the reasons why Raven is called the molecular muse. She does other molecules behind theobromine. She may do custom molecules. I'm not certain. We can ask her that question on Friday. But she's also produced a new book, which is called One Cacao Tree, with a subtitle of Backyard Cocoa, Tiny Fermentations, and Chocolate Making in the Tropics. So Raven, I believe, is in Hawaii. And so we're going to be talking with her about her new book, which I have. I've started reading through it. I think it's phenomenal. And there'll be a link to purchase the book and to learn more about Raven when I publish the post for the upcoming week. I'm in the middle of producing it right now. So I hope you can join us this coming Friday for my discussion with Raven Hanna. And then a week from today, I will be speaking with Spencer Hyman of Cocoa Runners in the UK. And with that, it's been a real blast. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me today. Please smash like, subscribe, share, comment, like, do all of those things on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And I look forward to having you back at some future Chocolate Life Live. And until then, everybody, please remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, I think you're doing it wrong.